Hey, you're listening to the wrong podcast. Topics today include priesthood, ethnicity, and cage.
Wrong! What's wrong with you? What's wrong with y'all?
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you people? Wrong! You do have to tolerate it. It's my show.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm here to talk about politics, culture, religion, sports, and anything else you're not allowed to talk about in polite company. Issue number 1. Pig. I am going to start off the show with some recommendations of things I am watching right now or have just recently watched. The first is this Nicolas Cage movie called Pig. Now, let me tell you the premise of the movie. The premise is that Nicolas Cage is a truffle farmer in Oregon, and somebody steals his pig, and he spends the rest of the movie trying to get his pig back. And you think that I'm setting up some sort of joke right now. I know you are. You're like, what? Okay, funny, ha ha ha. Yeah, this is like a ridiculous Nicolas Cage movie. Way to go, Tim. No, it's like a really good movie. Like it's like legit. Like I'm just as shocked as you that I watched it and that I enjoyed it. And there's not much more I can say about it other than parts of it will be extremely confusing to you as you're watching it. And always remember, if something's confusing, the movie will explain later. You know, that's just my general recommendation for watching things. Don't worry. If you don't get it, there's a reason you don't get it. They'll tell you later. Okay, the other recommendation is the Ken Burns documentary on Muhammad Ali. It was on PBS. I've recorded it months ago, and I'm just now watching it, and I am really enjoying it. Like, Ken Burns is excellent at what he does, and Muhammad Ali is a worthy subject. Super fascinating guy. So charismatic. And I have to say, I disagree with Muhammad Ali a lot on matters of race and religion. Particularly, I should say, about racial separation. Muhammad Ali believed that whites and blacks should be separated, that blacks should have their own state, and that we shouldn't try to integrate it all. And absolutely, I disagree with him about that. And he had a lot of awful things to say about white people, and some of them are frankly justified. With that caveat explained, the guy truly fought for religious freedom. Like, if you're a Christian, you need to recognize that his religious freedoms apply to you. And they apply to Scientologists, and they apply to Jews, and they apply to, alien cultist, whoever. His fight was for you, even though it was for his own reasons and reasons you might disagree with. He was a true believer, and he gave up a lot in order to protect his own religious liberty. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars, and he was willing to face 5 years in prison and willing to even be shot by the government if necessary. He truly believed that he should not fight in any war, and that included the Vietnam War. And I think we underestimate now how hated Muhammad Ali was at the time, publicly. Like, there's this thing about how when Martin Luther King Jr. marched on Washington and he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, like 75% of the public had a negative opinion of King at that time. And the negative opinions about Muhammad Ali must have been even greater. So those are my two recommendations, Pig and Muhammad Ali. Please go watch them. I promise you will enjoy them. Issue number 2. Banned. Okay, so the most notorious thing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what you might think of as the Mormon Church, the most notorious thing that comes to your mind is polygamy. And then the second thing is that they prevented blacks from full membership. And that's not exactly right, but that's probably what's in your head. The truth is that blacks were allowed to be members, but they were not allowed to, they were not given the priesthood in the Mormon faith. And I want to explain a few things about that and then tell you the history of this ban on blacks and the priesthood within the LDS Church. The first thing is that priesthood is very important in Mormonism. In Catholicism, you know that priests are important because they have priests, and those are the people, who run the churches, the local parishes. In Protestantism, priesthood is rather diminished. And it's not that we don't have a priesthood, it's that we rely on a priesthood of all believers. And this is something from 1 Peter. And we believe that any Christian is allowed to perform ordinances, to pray, to give blessings. That any believer is allowed to baptize any other believer. In Catholicism and Mormonism, that is not the case. And also, I don't know about Orthodoxy, but I believe that Orthodoxy also follows the Catholic model. And so if you want to baptize someone, you have to have the priesthood. In Mormonism, if you want to pray for healing for someone, you need to have the priesthood. You can't, just any Mormon can't do it. Any Latter-day Saint can't do it. They have to be endowed with the priesthood. Otherwise, the prayers are ineffective. And maybe ineffective isn't a great word, but it gets the idea across. They might choose a different word than ineffective. So, the priesthood is given to men only in the LDS Church, and there are two priesthoods. The first is the Aaronic priesthood, as in Aaron, Moses' brother. And young boys start to get this priesthood when they are 12 or, a year or so after they join the church, if they're older than 12. And then after the Aaronic priesthood comes the Melchizedek priesthood. And this is the priesthood so the Jewish people believe only Levites can have the priesthood. And the Bible makes the argument that there was another priesthood known as the Melchizedek priesthood. Melchizedek was a priest that Abraham visited. And Jesus is included in this other priesthood. Even though Jesus was not a Levite, he's still a priest. So that's where the concept comes from within the LDS Church. And no black member was allowed either of these priesthoods. In addition, blacks were prevented from entering into the temple to perform ordinances. Now, in LDS temples, they do a number of things. The first is that they baptize their ancestors. They get baptized by proxy for their ancestors. So you can't enter into fellowship with God in the afterlife unless you've been baptized. So if you have not been baptized, they have a solution that your relatives or somebody who's living now can be baptized in your place. And then you just have to accept this baptism. So blacks were allowed into the temples in order to do this baptism from the dead. But they were not allowed into the other parts of the temple where sealing ordinances were done, where marriages take place, where it's called the endowments, or you receive your endowments. In order that the LDS Church believes in universalism, they don't believe that anybody goes to hell, but that everyone is saved, except for people who might fight against the LDS, members of the LDS Church who apostatize. Man, that's a hard word. If you're a member and you start working against the church and you try to bring down the church, then outer darkness is reserved for you. But for everybody else, salvation is at hand as long as you're baptized or someone's you accept the baptism that somebody's done on your behalf. To reach the higher levels of heaven, you need to go through the temple and receive endowments. And they have special ceremonies and special prayers and rituals they perform. And blacks were not allowed to have these ordinances done on their behalf, or they were not allowed to do them themselves. They could not receive these endowments. So that meant that if you were a black member of the LDS Church, you were allowed to get married, but you could not get married in the LDS temple. You would have to just go to the justice of the peace. And marriage is vital for LDS religious purposes. In Protestantism and Catholicism, we don't believe that everyone has to get married. In fact, the Catholics explicitly say priests should not get married. And in the rest of the Christian tradition, we recognize that Jesus was not married, and therefore marriage is good but not necessary. Well, in the LDS faith, it is necessary. If you want to be in the highest reaches of heaven, you have had to have been married. And if not married, then somebody had to get married for you by proxy, just like baptism. So blacks would, perhaps maybe in heaven be married, but in earthly life, they did not receive the true Mormon, the true Latter-day Saint marriage ritual. So this ban was in place for well over 100 years. And what most people don't know is that Joseph Smith actually gave the priesthood to a black man named Elijah Abel. And he didn't go to I was about to get into the history of the LDS temple, and I'd just say that he didn't receive the endowments that Latter-day Saints receive in the temple, but he was allowed into a temple. And this was not well known that this black man had the priesthood. In 1852, so Joseph Smith dies. I talked about this earlier in another podcast episode. So Joseph Smith dies, and there's this succession crisis that I would love to talk about later. But basically, Brigham Young takes the bulk of the membership of the church, and they move in about 1847 to Utah en masse. Thousands of people move to Utah. It's a very hard trip, but they make it, and they start building a new society there. And when they go there, it's actually their intention to remove themselves from the United States of America entirely. Later, Utah is recognized as the U.S. territory. And in 1852, Brigham Young, he pronounces this ban on the priesthood for anyone from African descent. And nobody's exactly sure why or what caused him to make this declaration. But it's also at the same time that they're wrestling with what to do about slavery, and basically the LDS Church recognizes that slavery is okay, but they make some modifications to it. They think it's not humanitarian, so they come up with this concept called black servitude. So they announce that servitude is okay, and that blacks are not allowed to be priests in their faith. And there are many justifications over the years for why this has taken place. What happened, why particularly people from African descent should be excluded. There's a very popular theory among LDS that blacks were less valiant in the pre-existence when Jesus was fighting against Satan over what the salvation plan would be, and that people of African descent sat on the sidelines. They didn't choose a side. They remained neutral. And so their curse would be that they would be cursed with black skin, and they would be prevented from having the priesthood in this earthly life. It was a very popular theory about why this was. And it wasn't written down in anywhere in Mormon scriptures. You won't find that explicitly stated anywhere. But many Mormons believed it. They were Mormons at the time. And just to clarify, the current LDS prophet has asked that people not use the word Mormon at all. He says it's a victory for Satan when that word is used, that instead they should be referred to as Latter-day Saints. So that's why you'll see me tripping over my words occasionally. Just like the Ukraine, sometimes I use the old phrase. So many theories, including that popular one, are used. In about 1954, David O. McKay is the prophet of the church, and he really revolutionizes the church and how it's viewed by the U.S. government and by American culture at large. As I said, Brigham Young moved the church to Utah to get it out of the United States. The LDS view of the U.S. government was very, very low. David O. McKay, he changes that. He starts incorporating patriotism and American values into the LDS culture, and among his revisions to Mormon culture is he tries to remove this priesthood ban. And so you need to know that the LDS faith believes in continuing revelation. The scriptural canon is not closed. God still speaks. He still speaks through prophets. The prophet can say something new for this time and age, and it can be viewed as scripture. Now, for some reason, even though Brigham Young didn't make it scriptural that the blacks were not allowed to have the priesthood, it was kind of a policy thing. For some reason, Latter-day Saints thought that it had to be scripture, that it had to come from the prophet, and it had to be approved, just like all their other scriptures are approved, to reverse this ban on blacks. And so David O. McKay, he says, hey, I think God's telling me that blacks should receive the priesthood. And for that to be recognized by the rest of the church, there's a quorum of 12 apostles that have to approve what he says. They have to say, yes, we agree that this is scriptural. Now, the most radical revision in Mormon history was when a prophet said, hey, we're not practicing polygamy anymore. And the prophet at the time knew that the quorum of the 12 wouldn't approve this change. So he said, God told me, and then he went to the press and he had all the reporters tell everybody, hey, God told me that we're not practicing polygamy anymore. And the quorum of the 12 found out just like everybody else did. And this created attention for them. They're like, okay, if we say that the prophet is wrong, then we kind of destroy we destroy the theological basis of our church. We say that the prophet is wrong and he's not speaking for God. So that prophet at the time, he figured out a loophole that the quorum was not happy about, but still he found a loophole. Well, David O. McKay, he didn't want to do it that way. He wanted to go through the proper channels. So he presents this revelation to them that blacks can receive the priesthood, and it has to be unanimous, and it's not unanimous. The apostles don't agree. So the ban stays in place. 20 years go by, more than 20 years go by, and the church is facing more and more pressure about this priesthood ban. The Civil Rights Amendment has already passed 10 years earlier. The March on Washington has taken place in the 60s, but here it is, 1978, and nothing has changed for the LDS Church. And part of the reason why is when they went to Utah, they were seeking to be left alone by the U.S. government and by the larger American culture. They were practicing polygamy. They wanted to practice their beliefs in isolation, and so they moved to Utah. And that isolation inculcated them from larger changes that were happening in the rest of society, including recognizing that blacks had been mistreated and poorly treated and excluded from equality in the American culture. Utah was, much more integrated at that point, but still pretty isolated. More than 75% of the population at the time of Utah was LDS. So these changes were slow to come into the state. Well, they're also, at this time, they've got missionary efforts across the world. And they've got this huge missionary effort in Brazil. And it's very successful. They're winning souls over. People are joining the church. They're about to build a temple in Brazil. The problem is, Brazil is much different than the United States when it comes to race. Brazilians don't see race. There's all kinds of racial, interracial marriage, and nobody knows who's black and who's white and who's a mix and who's Spanish or whatever. Like, it isn't like it is in the United States, where there's very clear lines. And in general, in the United States, Southern segregationists had this one drop rule. If you had one drop of African blood in you, then you were considered black. And the LDS Church basically followed the same suit. If you had any African descendancy in you, too bad. It doesn't matter if it was 16 generations back, you're black. Well, this is a big problem in Brazil because nobody's sure, and at the same time, everybody's sure that they've all got some African blood in them. There's no distinguishing. And if they're going to have a successful church, they need priests and they need people to go to the temple and to it'd be a non-functional church if they were to operate in Brazil the way they did in the United States. So this is a huge issue for them. At the same time, the NCAA is starting to really have some issues with Brigham Young University over this issue. Other universities are saying, hey, we're not going to play any sporting events against them because of this. We're going to boycott them. We're going to exclude them over this. This is not right. And there's a Christian fundamentalist university in South Carolina called Bob Jones University. Now, Bob Jones explicitly said blacks were not allowed to attend. And they also, eventually in 1971, they say, okay, blacks can attend, but there can be no interracial dating at all. And the U.S. government says, hey, if you want to do that, that's cool, but we are revoking your tax exempt status. People are going to have to, you're going to have to pay taxes on the money you receive, and people aren't going to be able to claim their donations to you on their tax returns. And Bob Jones University relents. They say, okay, we'll give all that up. We need our tax exempt status. And because of that, there's this feeling that the same kind of pressure is going to be put on Brigham Young and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So in 1978, Spencer Kimball, he asked the Quorum of the 12 to pray about this issue, to see if there might be a change. And in fact, there is. They agree, yes, it's time to change. And they come out with a new revelation that the priesthood is for all people, all races. And everybody rejoices. They're so glad that this is finally over. And again, it's just peculiar that it wasn't written down in Scripture anywhere that blacks be excluded, but they needed a prophetic revelation. They needed Scripture to say that it was now okay. Well, over time, the church has tried to move on from this. They've been growing in Africa ever since then. They've grown in Brazil. And recently, within the last 10 years, the church has been dealing with some of the rougher patches of their history. Some questions about how, polygamy was practiced, and they've come out with how Joseph Smith received revelation, etc. People have questions about these, and they're running to the internet for answers. And the LDS Church had no good answers on the internet for these. They had no apologetics for these things. So they come out with these articles, these essays called the Gospel Topic Essays, that attempt to explain and give a defense for why the church believes certain ways, or why they did things certain ways in the past, or why they continue to do certain things. And these essays are not easy to find on their website. They are on the website, but they are not like in the top navigation. You have to search for them. And the best way to find them is actually to do a web search. To just go to Google or Bing and type in gospel topics essays, LDS gospel topic essays, and then ask your question. Polygamy, blacks in the priesthood, etc. Google will help you find it more than their own site. So in their essay on this on race and the priesthood, the LDS Church, the prophet of the church, approved this message. He wrote it, he released it. I don't know if he wrote it, but he released it under his own name. So speaking about the restriction on blacks receiving the priesthood, the essay says, the justifications for this restriction echoed the widespread ideas about racial inferiority that had been used to argue for the legalization of black servitude in the territory of Utah. Although slavery was not a significant factor in Utah's economy and was soon abolished, the restriction on priesthood ordinations remained. So, two things I want to say about that first. One, some of this stuff is a little weaselly. Like, for example, in the essay about polygamy, they say that Joseph Smith married a girl who was just a few months shy of her 15th birthday, which means she was 14. Just say she was 14. But in this case, it says that slavery or black servitude was soon abolished in Utah, shortly after it was established. Well, do you know how and why it was abolished? By Congress, by Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War was taking place, and Congress said, hey, no slavery anywhere in the country or territories of the United States. So it's not like the church soon changed their mind on slavery. No, it was enacted by Congress on them. Second, this paragraph says that God didn't ordain this restriction on blacks in the priesthood. It was just the regular culture that influenced and created it. And that means that God wasn't protecting the church the way he should have from this egregious error. In fact, it was just the follies of men that were perpetuated by other sinful racist men caused it. And there was a lot of talk that this came from God. Like the LDS heard that from their leaders over and over again, that this wasn't just, hey, this is just the way people do it. This is the way white people in America do it. No, they heard consistently that God said that this is the way it had to be, even though it wasn't written down anywhere. And this essay refutes that claim entirely. And this is a problem for many Latter-day Saints. Some are like, yeah, of course they made errors. All people make errors. That's no big deal. But the LDS have been told that the prophet cannot lead them astray. And it appears, at least in this one instance, he did. Remember, I want to know what's wrong with you.
What's wrong with you?
If you'd like to submit a question, topic, or tell me how I was wrong, you can email me at listen@thewrongpodcast.com or submit a comment on my website, thewrongpodcast.com. And help me spread the wrong message. If you like what you hear, share it with your friends. Now it's time for my favorite part of the show. I was wrong.
I was wrong. I was wrong.
Listener Susan writes in, thanks to you, as of this afternoon, I have a better understanding of what is going on in Ukraine, as well as a greater appreciation of pencils. Thanks, Susan. I appreciate the encouragement. Issue number 3. Whoopi! Okay, there is a big brouhaha that broke out shortly after I released my last episode. And it would have been great to talk about this while I was recording this episode, but it came out afterwards. And so I am catching up on lost time. This week, Whoopi Goldberg, she, I'll get to Whoopi in a moment. But first, let me just say that there are often arguments and confusions in our country over the difference between gender and sex. We use those terms interchangeably. I took a medical survey just this week, and they asked me they said, what's your gender, male or female or non-binary, or prefer not to say. And male is not a word that we use to describe gender. Masculine is a word we use to describe gender. Male is a word we use to describe biological sex. And this was a scientific survey. People, even scientists, are confused about the difference between sex and gender. In addition, we have a lot of confusion about the word race and ethnicity. Those two words are often used interchangeably. And I want to get into why that is and what the difference is and why it matters. Caveat being, I get stuff wrong sometimes. And you might misunderstand what I'm saying. I might misunderstand what I'm saying. We all need grace in these areas where confusion exists, to recognize that, hey, maybe somebody's talking about something different than what I mean by that same word. That being said, there's a general notion right now that race is not a thing. There is no such thing as race. There's no biological way you can determine somebody's race. You can use biology to determine someone's sex, male or female, but there is nothing that says, hey, this person is white, or this person is black, or this person is Asian. There is no test. And here's something from Wikipedia. Modern science regards race as a social construct. That means it's just something people made up, just like language or the rules of baseball. Race is a social construct, an identity which is assigned based on rules made by society. While partially based on physical similarities within groups, race does not have an inherent physical or biological meaning. So this is the general idea that scientists are coming to, that there is no such thing as a white race or a black race or an Asian race. It's just something that we've made up. For example, I mentioned the one drop rule before. White segregationists said if you've got one drop of black blood of African descent, then you are black. And the truth is, now that we have modern DNA tests, a lot of people who had no idea had African ancestry in them, in fact do. And the DNA tests prove it. And they fit all the stereotypes of a white guy, but in fact, they've got one drop and they didn't even know. And if you believe in common descent, or, if you believe in the traditional 6-day creationism, you understand that race doesn't make sense. That there was one people, there was one person, there was one male and one female of the species, and we all kind of derive from that origin. There weren't 3 different distinct human species that all became known as black, white, Asian, or Native American, or whatever other kind of racial distinctions you might use. Now, before I get into Whoopi, I want to say one thing about The View and hot takes, and it's a big problem. We have this industry on TV and radio that's based on people saying radical things that get people riled up. Whoa, that's a hot take. Like that, it kind of came out of sports talk radio where somebody says something radical like, Babe Ruth was a bad baseball player, and everybody gets upset and they listen to this guy because he's saying something crazy, and you want to hear people tell him he's wrong. And The View is a show based on hot takes. And often the panelists are not well informed about what they're talking about, and they have to say something quick. They might be well educated, but they have to boil it down to a 45-second soundbite. That's all the time they've got to discuss this major, controversial, nuanced, complex topic. They got to boil it down, and it's got to be hot. And sometimes they're not even stating their own opinions. There's a producer whispering in their ear, hey, we need you to say something opposite of what she's saying. What about, what about green people? Whatever. Like that's what the producer is telling the panelists to say, and she needs to say something along those lines. And maybe she doesn't even understand what the producer is trying to get her to say, but she needs to say something along that way and say it quickly so that the discussion can move on. So that this item that somebody's looking for was at least mentioned. And this is a problematic way to talk about things. You just need to know that this is not a good way to discuss important topics in our culture. Could be fun, could be entertaining, but it's not a great way. And so here we come to Whoopi Goldberg. This week, she said that the Holocaust was not, the Jewish Holocaust perpetuated by the Nazis, was not about race. Here's her words exactly.
Well, also, if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race.
No, it's about a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about.
But it's about white supremacy. It's about
but it's not about
ideal race.
But these are two white groups of people.
Well, they go after black
people
people
see them as white people.
But you're missing the point. You're missing the point. The minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about it for what it is. It's how people treat each other. It's a problem. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, because black, white, Jews, everybody eats each other. So if you're uncomfortable, if you hear about mouse, should you be worried? Should your child say, oh my God, I wonder if that's me? No, that's not what they're going to say. They're going to say, I don't want to be like that.
Well, hopefully.
I want to be cool.
Yeah. Most kids, they don't want to be cruel.
No, they don't.
And we're living in an era where people are comparing vaccine cards to the yellow stars, where people are comparing vaccinations to what Anne Frank went through.
Yeah.
So it is necessary for kids to learn about the Holocaust.
Learn about man's inhumanity to man, however it exposes itself. I have to cut you off.
I just want to say that mouse was banned, and it flew to top 20 of Amazon's rules last week, charts.
Yes.
The more you ban it, the more we want to read it.
Now, this caused a lot of people to be upset because, of course, the Holocaust was about race. The Nazis said it's about race. And I want to go back to something I talked about last week, and that was that the Antidefamation League, which is an organization devoted to fighting anti-Semitism, they recently changed their definition of racism. And I disagreed with their change. They went from a broad definition to a very specific definition. And in my last episode 54, I talk about why I have a problem with that. Here's their new definition again. Racism is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Now, shortly after Whoopi Goldberg made these statements that the Holocaust was not about race, that it was a white-on-white crime, is basically what she was saying, Jonathan Greenblatt, leader of the Antidefamation League, he went on Twitter and he said, "No, at Whoopi Goldberg, the Holocaust was about the Nazis' systematic annihilation of the Jewish people, who they deemed to be an inferior race." Now, in Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler had this to say. He said, "Is not their very existence founded on one great lie, namely, that they are a religious community where in reality they are a race?" So Hitler thought they were a race. The leader of the ADL says that yes, in fact, this was about race. Even though they were both white, it was a racial issue. So I read this article by Jeffrey Salkin. I'll include it in my show notes so you can read the whole thing. But I'll say, he's a Jewish writer, and he had this to say: "The Jews are not a race. Though it was once fashionable for Jews, Philo-Semites, and anti-Semites to think so, any visit to Israel will dispel this notion. Actually, you don't need a 12-hour plane flight to learn that. Go into any synagogue, and you will see Jews of all colors and races. Come to my religious school. Look at how the students look. Jews are not a race." But the Nazis thought the Jews constituted a race, and they applied the most sadistic version of pseudoscience to that definition. The Holocaust was about race, the Jewish race, as the Nazis defined it. So, the idea here is, Jews are not a race, but the Nazis thought the Jews were a race. Therefore, the Nazis are guilty of racism. And to further this idea, white supremacists are wrong that there is a race of white people. But because they think there is, they're guilty of racism. There is such a thing as tribalism and ethnic violence and ethnic bigotry. And racism is basically taking those small distinctions and blowing up the group, making the group larger than it was. So it's not just the Aryans who are white people, it's all the British and the Swedes and the Norwegians. It's all people of Europe who are a part of this bigger tribe, and this tribe is known as white people. And the tribe is so large, it in fact is a race. And we know that race isn't real. It doesn't actually biologically exist. But that doesn't prevent people from grouping together into something that they think is a race. So, later, Whoopi Goldberg, she went on Twitter, and she said, "On today's show, I said the Holocaust is not about race, but about man's inhumanity to man. I should have said it's about both. As Jonathan Greenblatt from the Antidefamation League shared, the Holocaust was about the Nazi systematic annihilation of the Jewish people, who they deemed to be an inferior race. I stand corrected." And I have to say, this is a pretty good apology from Whoopi Goldberg. She explained where she was wrong, how she was wrong. And I think, like, there's lots of debates about whether apologies are non-apologies, or, I'm sorry you were offended by my words kind of things. No, she says I was wrong. And she asked for, she said she's asking for an apology, or asking for her apology to be acknowledged. Later that day, she went on the Stephen Colbert show, and she talked more about this. And here is a clip. This is just part of what she had to say to Stephen Colbert.
My thought process.
Have you come to understand that the Nazis saw it as race? Well, because they might, asking the Nazis, they would say, yes, it's a racial issue.
Well, see, this is what's interesting to me, because the Nazis lied. It wasn't. They had issues with ethnicity, not with race, because most of the Nazis were white people, and most of the people they were attacking were white people. So to me, I'm thinking, how can you say it's about race if you are fighting each other? So it all really began because I said, how will we explain to children what happened in Nazi Germany? I said, this wasn't racial. This was about white on white. And everybody said, no, it was racial. And so that's what this all came from.
Now, there is a general sense that Whoopi had it wrong. And that's all any of us can say about it is Whoopi was wrong. And I think, actually, that Whoopi was making a good point, but making it poorly. And I think she was saying, hey, people are going to find a way to hate one another and mistreat each other no matter what. And it doesn't have to be about race. It doesn't have to be about the color of the skin, for example, is what she was trying to make a point about. People will hurt one another. And there's a quote by someone who said, the Nazis didn't need the Jews to exist as a race. They would have invented them, even if they didn't exist. People can find a way to distinguish themselves from one another, no matter what. And Whoopi was wrong. The Holocaust was about race. And Whoopi has something true to say. ethnic differences exist. We recognize them, we should celebrate them, and it's not all cut and dry when it comes to ethnicity either. And sometimes what we're calling racial segregation is actually ethnic segregation or ethnic bigotry or ethnic bias. It's not necessarily about race. It's just we're unclear about the difference between ethnicity and race. And so we apply the word race when it's actually ethnicity. Now, there's just one more thing that really needs to be mentioned. Whoopi Goldberg. That's her stage name. She chose a Jewish last name for her name. Some people have actually thought, oh, she is Jewish. No, she's not Jewish. In fact, when asked about it, she says that she feels Jewish. She hasn't converted to the religion. She honors the high holy days, but doesn't practice the religion in any way. She doesn't ethnically have a Jewish background. It's just a stage name. And there's some sort of irony there. I don't even know if I can point it out. But Rachel Dolezal, she was the white woman who was the head of a local NAACP chapter who claimed that she felt like she was black, and nobody was having it. It was not allowed. But apparently, you can feel Jewish, and that's okay. You just can't feel black. But I could be wrong. If you think I am, let me know. And let me know why. I had fun, and I hope you did too. Bye-bye.